Springfield, Oregon, a quiet community surrounded by pine woods and mountain air. But on the morning of May 21, 1998, this peaceful town would be thrust into one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in American school history. There are places in America where the pace of life moves gently, where each sunrise feels like a familiar friend returning. Springfield, Oregon, in the late 1990s was one of those places. A working-class city just east of Eugene, built around timber, small businesses, and generations of families who had lived there their whole lives. It was a town defined by neighborly ties, by Friday night football games, by children biking through tree-lined streets on their way to school. It was the kind of place where people waved from their yards, where teachers greeted students by name, and where parents trusted the mornings to unfold in their usual rhythm. May 21st began like any other, a crisp Thursday, the air carrying the coolness that settles in before Oregon's early summer. Birds cut through the quiet with their first songs. In many homes, kitchen lights flickered on, lunches were packed, backpacks slung over tired shoulders. Teenagers hurried out the door, some half awake, some excited for the day ahead. Younger siblings followed their routines. Parents called out reminders, "Don't forget your homework. I'll see you after practice." These were moments repeated endlessly across Springfield, the ordinary rhythms of an ordinary town. At Thurston High School, the morning promised nothing out of the ordinary. The campus, framed by hills and tall fir trees, was starting to come alive. The cafeteria staff prepared breakfast. Custodians made their early rounds. Teachers reviewed lesson plans for upcoming finals. Seniors counted down the weeks until graduation. Students arrived laughing, yawning, planning after-school activities, comparing notes for upcoming exams. It was a place filled with youth, energy, and expectation, a school like any other in America. But beneath this peaceful beginning, something unimaginable was already in motion. A chain of events set over the previous 24 hours would shatter the calm of Springfield forever. The students stepping into the school that morning did not know that their lives, their sense of safety, and their understanding of the world were about to change in a single devastating moment. As the sun continued to rise, the city moved through its routines unaware. Coffee brewed in local diners, workers clocked in at timber mills and small shops. The air carried the hum of everyday life. In neighborhoods surrounding Thurston High, parents trusted that their children were walking into one of the safest places they knew, their school. Nothing in Springfield's history could have prepared the community for what was coming. Across town, families were unaware that law enforcement had already begun uncovering a horrifying discovery at a Springfield home. Unfolding quietly, out of the public's view, police were piecing together the first fragments of a tragedy that would soon overwhelm the entire region. The disconnect between the calm morning and the magnitude of what was about to happen gave the day an eerie stillness, the kind that people would later describe as unforgettable. By mid-morning, the school campus buzzed with its usual routine. Students filled the cafeteria before the first bell. Friends gathered at their usual tables. Some talked about weekend plans. Others joked about tests or shared stories about their morning bus ride. Teachers walked through the hallways, greeting students with familiar warmth. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. And yet, in the next few minutes, the town would cross a point of no return. What happened that morning would become one of the most devastating school tragedies of the late 1990s. It would shake the foundations of Springfield, a community that valued safety, connection, and the simple beauty of everyday life. Overnight, the city would be thrust into national headlines, not because of what it built, but because of what had been lost. People often describe traumatic events in terms of before and after. Before, the world makes sense. After, everything is different. For Springfield, Oregon, May 21, 1998 became that dividing line. Before, Thurston High School was a place filled with hope and the promise of future accomplishments. After, it would become the site of a tragedy that scarred families, students, teachers, and the entire community for generations. Before, Springfield was known for its forests, its mills, its traditions, and its unwavering sense of community. After, it would forever carry the weight of a day when an innocence was stolen from its young people, when heartbreak echoed down its hallways. But this story is not only about tragedy, it is also about resilience, the strength of students who protected one another, the heroism of young people who acted with courage, the compassion of first responders, the unity of a community that refused to let grief destroy its spirit. It is about remembering those who were lost and honoring those whose lives were forever changed. And the events of May 21st were not just a headline. They were lived experiences, felt in real time, in real classrooms, by real families. They became memories that the people of Springfield would carry with them for the rest of their lives. And so, as we begin this journey through one of the most painful chapters in the town's history, we do so with care, with respect, and with the understanding that behind every moment lies a human story. This is the story of a peaceful morning shattered, a community shaken, and a day Springfield will never forget. In the months and years before May 21, 1998, Thurston High School stood as a symbol of youthful energy and possibility in Springfield, Oregon. The school sat nestled between quiet neighborhoods and the green foothills of the Cascades, a place where students arrived each morning believing that the world ahead of them was wide, open, and full of promise. Its hallways buzzed with the ordinary excitement of teenagers living out the familiar rhythms of high school life, friendships growing deeper, dreams taking shape, futures beginning to form one day at a time. Thurston High had a reputation for strong academics, spirited sports teams, and teachers who were deeply invested in their students' futures. Many educators had taught there for decades and watched generations of Springfield families pass through their classrooms. Their work extended far beyond instruction. They were mentors, guides, and trusted adults who knew when a student needed encouragement or when they simply needed someone to notice them. This was the heart of Thurston, a place where learning and belonging were intertwined. Before the tragedy, the school community carried an easy confidence. The campus was alive with the familiar markers of teenage life. Students gathered at lockers to talk about weekend games, upcoming dances, and the stress of final exams. Seniors counted the days until graduation, imagining the adventures that awaited them after crossing the stage. Juniors practiced for driver's tests. Freshmen slowly adjusted to navigating crowded hallways and finding their place in a larger world. Every day brought small victories and frustrations, forgotten homework, earned accomplishments, and shared laughter. These were the building blocks of a normal, hopeful adolescence. The cafeteria, which would later become a central detail in the tragedy, was once just a buzzing hub of social life. Friends met at their usual spots before class, joking, planning their afternoons, or reviewing notes for difficult courses. Some students arrived early to eat breakfast. Others simply came for company before the bell. Staff members served food with friendly familiarity, knowing the students who always came for extra milk or the ones who preferred to sit quietly near the windows. Sports played a significant role in the identity of Thurston High. The school's teams brought families together throughout the year. Football games lit up Friday nights and gave the community something to rally around. Basketball season filled the gym with energy. Track meets showcased the stamina and determination of the school's athletes. Families, friends, and alumni packed the stands, cheering on their kids with unwavering pride. These were moments that defined the culture of Thurston, moments of unity, shared joy, and tradition.
Beyond athletics, the school's clubs, music programs, and art classes offered students creative spaces to discover themselves. Band practices filled the air with notes of rehearsed melodies, preparing for performances that parents would attend with cameras ready. In art rooms, young creators experimented with colors and shapes, imagining futures filled with design, craft, and expressiveness. Drama students rehearsed lines in empty classrooms, preparing for school plays that brought laughter and applause from the community. The spirit of Thurston was not just academic, it was deeply human, shaped by the passions and talents of its students. Teachers at Thurston fostered an environment that felt safe and supportive. Many had open-door policies, welcoming conversations about schoolwork, personal challenges, or future goals. They attended student games, performances, and events because they believed in showing up for their students both inside and outside the classroom. Their presence reinforced a sense of community that extended beyond academics, one rooted in mutual care and respect. Parents trusted Thurston High. They saw it as a place where their children were guided, challenged, and prepared for adult life. Morning routines across Springfield often included the simple comfort of knowing that when their teenagers walked into the school, they were stepping into a community that looked out for their best interests. That trust, so naturally woven into daily life, reflected the stability of the school's reputation. For students, Thurston was more than a campus. It was a social world, a second home, and the backdrop to thousands of small stories that made up their teenage years. It was a place where friendships were formed that would last long after graduation, where young people discovered strengths they didn't know they had, where the future felt open, limitless, and real. In the spring of 1998, the school year was nearing its end. Warm weather had started to return. Seniors were preparing for their final weeks on campus. The hallways carried a sense of anticipation, not of fear, but of celebration. Students talked about summer jobs, weekend outings, and upcoming milestones. There was laughter between classes, music echoing faintly from practice rooms, and the distant sound of athletic teams training outdoors. Life moved with a gentle rhythm that felt both ordinary and beautiful. And in those days before the tragedy, there was no reason to imagine anything else. The school felt safe because it had always been safe. The students felt protected because their community had always protected them. Parents breathed easily because the world, as they knew it, gave them every reason to believe that their children would return home each afternoon with stories of their day, stories of friends, academics, and the everyday adventures of growing up. That sense of normalcy, that unwavering trust makes what happened next even more heartbreaking. Because the story of Thurston High before May 21, 1998, is not a story of fear. It is a story of life, vibrant, hopeful, and full of potential. It is a story of a school that nurtured its young people, a community that believed in its strength, and families who never imagined that their world could change so suddenly. Before the tragedy, Thurston High was simply a place where futures were beginning, a place defined by connection, a place filled with light.
And it is that life, that spirit, that innocence, which makes what followed so difficult to comprehend. In the hours before the tragedy at Thurston High School, events unfolded quietly inside a home on the outskirts of Springfield. What occurred there would become a critical part of the investigation. A sequence of actions confirmed through police reports, collected evidence, and court records. These events marked the beginning of a timeline that would forever alter the lives of everyone connected to Thurston High. On the afternoon of May 20th, 1998, The day before the shooting, police were called to Thurston High after a student was found with a firearm on campus. The weapon had been discovered by school staff, and officers responded immediately. The student, Kip Kinkel, was taken into custody. The situation was handled through standard procedures, retrieving the weapon, contacting parents, and transporting the student to the local police station for questioning. Records show that the interrogation focused on how the student obtained the weapon and why it had been brought onto school grounds. Officers processed the incident, and later that day, after the formal procedures were completed, Kinkel's father picked him up and brought him home. It appeared, at least on the surface, that the matter would continue through the disciplinary channels normally used for such incidents. Nothing in the moment suggested the full magnitude of what would follow. What happened later inside the Kinkel home, however, would soon become central to the unfolding tragedy. According to verified police findings, both of Kinkel's parents were killed inside the house sometime after he was released from custody. Investigators later determined that the deaths occurred on May 20th, though no one outside the home was aware of what had happened until the following day. These events were deeply shocking to the community, and even in official accounts, they are described with great sensitivity, acknowledging the profound loss without delving into detail. Throughout the evening, neighbors noticed nothing unusual. The house remained quiet. There were no signs that anything had occurred. Springfield prepared for another ordinary night, unaware that 2 lives had already been taken, and that the next morning would bring tragedy on a scale the town had never known. Inside the home, police would later find writings, notes, and materials left behind by Kinkel. These documents became part of the investigation, offering insight into his thoughts at the time, but none provided a clear explanation or singular motive. Officials have emphasized this point repeatedly over the years. While the writings revealed emotional turmoil, they do not justify or fully explain the actions that followed. Investigators were cautious to present these materials as context, not as causation. As evening turned into night, the world outside the home remained unaware. Students across Springfield finished their homework, prepared for the next school day, and drifted into sleep. Teachers graded papers and planned lessons. Parents checked in on their children and turned out the lights. Life continued, as it always did, with quiet routine and familiar comfort. While the events inside the Kinkel home were unfolding, there was no warning to the outside world. No calls to authorities, no signs to neighbors, no indication that something catastrophic had already taken place. The tragedy remained contained within the walls of one house, hidden from a community that trusted in its sense of safety. The next morning, the timeline began to accelerate. Verified accounts show that before leaving the house, Kinkel armed himself with multiple weapons and ammunition that had been stored in the home. He also carried the firearm that had been confiscated by school staff the previous day, but later returned to his father as part of the official procedure. These details would later become crucial pieces of evidence in reconstructing the full sequence of events. The fact that 2 lives had been lost inside the home remained undiscovered until after the shooting at Thurston High. When investigators eventually entered the residence later that day, they found the bodies of Bill and Faith Kinkel. Their deaths added a second layer of devastation to an already overwhelming tragedy. Friends, colleagues, and community members who knew the Kinkels were left in shock. They remembered them as loving parents, deeply involved in their children's lives, and active supporters of local school programs. Their loss reverberated through Springfield like a second wave of grief. As law enforcement pieced together the timeline in the days that followed, they identified the events inside the home as the first stage of the tragedy that would culminate at Thurston High. The killings were handled with extreme care by investigators and later by the court, out of respect for the family and the community. Over the years, officials have consistently emphasized the importance of remembering that 2 innocent people were lost even before the shooting at the school occurred. When examined in hindsight,
The events of May 20th painted a picture of a situation that escalated rapidly and without the knowledge of anyone outside the household. The school, the police, and the community had no way of knowing that anything beyond the firearm incident had taken place. There were no outward signals, no warnings, only silence. This silence would break the next morning, not in the quiet of a residential neighborhood, but in the bustling cafeteria of Thurston High School. The hours leading up to that moment, though hidden from public view, formed the haunting backdrop of the tragedy that would soon unfold. They marked the beginning of a story that Springfield would carry with it for decades, a story of loss, of shock, and of a community forced to confront heartbreak on two fronts: the violence inside a family home and the violence inside a school. What happened next would move the tragedy from one household to an entire community, changing the lives of hundreds of students and families forever.
The morning of May 21, 1998, began with the quiet calm that Springfield residents had come to expect. Dawn broke over the foothills, casting a soft light across the neighborhoods surrounding Thurston High School. Birds moved through the branches of tall Oregon firs, and a cool breeze drifted through open windows as families prepared for the day ahead. Nothing in those early hours hinted at the tragedy that was only minutes away. For many students, the day began like any other school morning: rushed breakfasts, quick conversations, and the familiar scramble to get out the door before the first bell. Teens walked to campus in small groups or were dropped off by parents who believed their children were entering one of the safest places in their world. The trust was complete, instinctive, built over years of normal days and routine schedules. Inside Thurston High, the campus was beginning to hum with life. Janitors had finished their early rounds. Teachers were arriving carrying stacks of grading, sipping coffee, or exchanging morning greetings with colleagues. The air held the anticipation of a typical school day: lessons ahead, tests to be taken, after-school activities to be planned. Students flowed into the building through the main entrances and side doors, heading toward the cafeteria, the usual gathering spot before classes began. In the cafeteria, the scene was as ordinary as it could be. Friends clustered at familiar tables. Some students laughed loudly. Others rested their heads on their arms, still waking up. A few flipped through notebooks or compared answers for assignments they'd rushed to finish the night before. Cafeteria staff moved with practiced ease, serving breakfast and navigating the morning bustle. At the same time, buses were pulling into the loop outside. Doors swung open. Students stepped onto the sidewalk, and the steady flow of teenagers made its way toward the heart of the campus. Among them was Kip Kinkel, carrying a concealed stockpile of weapons. The events inside his home the night before had remained undiscovered. No alarm had been raised. No teacher, student, or administrator had any indication of what he was carrying or what had already occurred. To everyone around him, he was simply another student entering the building at the start of the day. Witnesses would later describe the atmosphere as entirely normal, nothing unusual, nothing alarming, nothing that set the morning apart from any other. It was this unbroken sense of routine that made the minutes leading up to the tragedy so haunting. Life was unfolding exactly as it always had, unaware of the irreversible break that was coming. As more students gathered in the cafeteria, the space filled with chatter and the clatter of trays, the clock approached the time when students would begin dispersing to their first period classes. Some discussed weekend plans, others joked about homework. A few sat alone, enjoying a quiet moment before the school day began in full. Teachers walked past the cafeteria windows, heading toward classrooms and preparing for attendance. Staff moved through the hallways with relaxed confidence. The building, full of hundreds of students and adults, felt safe and familiar, a home for learning, not a place of fear. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Springfield, parents were starting their own routines. Many had already driven to work. Others were preparing to leave. A few were catching the last glimpse of their children walking toward school, trusting that the day ahead would be uneventful. They had no way to know that within minutes, the peace of their community would be shattered.
Back at the school, Kinkel entered the cafeteria without drawing attention. There were no words exchanged that signaled danger, no moments that set him apart from the rest of the crowd. The morning's normalcy held steady until the very instant it broke. Investigators would later reconstruct these final moments before the shooting using witness statements, surveillance details, and the physical layout of the cafeteria. According to these accounts, Kinkel positioned himself inside the crowded room just before the gunfire began. Students nearby continued their conversations. None realized that the next few seconds would transform their lives forever. Then, without warning, the first shots were fired. In that instant, the atmosphere of the cafeteria changed from relaxed morning chatter to stunned confusion. The normal sounds of school life were replaced with chaos, students scrambling, teachers reacting, lives shifting in an instant. The rhythm of a typical morning was replaced by fear, shock, and the desperate instinct to find safety. Those first seconds marked the transition from normal life into tragedy, a boundary that could never be crossed back. What had been a simple Thursday morning became the darkest day in Thurston High's history. Outside the school, the world remained unaware for a brief moment longer. The breeze still moved through the trees. Cars still passed along the main roads. Parents still believed their children were safe inside their classrooms, but they had no way to know that within minutes, the peace of their community would be shattered. Back at the school, Kinkel entered the cafeteria without drawing attention. There were no words exchanged that signaled danger, no moments that set him apart from the rest of the crowd. The morning's normalcy held steady until the very instant it broke. Investigators would later reconstruct these final moments before the shooting using witness statements, surveillance details, and the physical layout of the cafeteria. According to these accounts, Kinkel positioned himself inside the crowded room just before the gunfire began. Students nearby continued their conversations. None realized that the next few seconds would transform their lives forever. Then, without warning, the first shots were fired. In that instant, the atmosphere of the cafeteria changed from relaxed morning chatter to stunned confusion. The normal sounds of school life were replaced by chaos, students scrambling, teachers reacting, lives shifting in an instant. The rhythm of a typical morning was replaced by fear, shock, and the desperate instinct to find safety. Those first seconds marked the transition from normal life into tragedy, a boundary that could never be crossed back. What had been a simple Thursday morning became the darkest day in Thurston High's history. Outside the school, the world remained unaware for a brief moment longer. The breeze still moved through the trees. Cars still passed along the main roads. Parents still believed their children were safe inside their classrooms. But inside the cafeteria, everything had changed. Students would later remember the surreal disorientation of those first moments, the disbelief, the confusion, the overwhelming need to understand what was happening. Teachers reacted immediately, some shielding students, others rushing toward danger to protect the young people in their care. The community's strength, though not yet visible, was already forming in the actions of students and staff who refused to abandon one another. The shooting had begun. The tragedy was unfolding. And Springfield, though still unaware, was about to be thrust into heartbreak. The next moments would test the courage of teenagers, the resolve of teachers, and the resilience of an entire community. What happened inside the cafeteria would change the story of Thurston High forever.
The first shots inside the Thurston High School cafeteria created a wave of shock that swept across the room in an instant. Moments earlier, the space had been filled with the ordinary noise of a school morning, conversations, laughter, the scrape of chairs on the floor. Now, all of it collapsed into chaos. Students looked up in disbelief, unsure of what they were hearing, as the reality of the moment rushed toward them faster than they could process. When the shooting began, many students instinctively dove for the floor,
some shielding friends, others reaching out to pull classmates behind tables or into corners. For many, the first reaction was confusion, the sense that something impossible was happening in a place they had always believed to be safe. In those early seconds, fear mixed with disbelief, and the foundations of normal life gave way to sudden panic. Teachers nearby responded with remarkable courage. Some rushed toward the cafeteria, acting on instinct to protect the students in their care. Others shouted for students to take cover, to stay low, to move to safer areas of the building. Their actions, though taken in split seconds, would later be remembered as acts of selfless bravery. They were not trained for such a moment, yet they moved with a clarity of purpose that reflected the depth of their commitment to their students. Inside the cafeteria, the situation escalated rapidly. Students huddled together, some holding on to one another, others trying to help those near them. The noise, the movement, the sudden collapse of normalcy, all of it created a scene that would remain etched in the memories of those present for the rest of their lives. Amid the chaos, something extraordinary began to unfold. Several students, realizing the danger around them, decided to confront the gunman directly. They acted not out of recklessness, but out of a profound instinct to protect their classmates. These were teenagers, young people who, in a moment of unbearable fear, found the strength to do something extraordinary. Among them was Jacob Riker, who had already been wounded. Despite his injury, he continued forward, refusing to retreat. As the gunman attempted to reload, Riker and several other students, including his brother Josh, rushed toward him. Their timing was critical, their courage unmistakable. Together, they tackled the shooter, bringing him to the ground and restraining him long enough for others to help secure the situation. This act of bravery, carried out by teenagers in the midst of an unfolding tragedy, prevented further loss of life. Investigators, officials, and community members would later recognize their actions as nothing short of heroic. In the darkest moment of their young lives, these students made a decision that saved others. Their courage became one of the most powerful threads in the story of that day. The shooting stopped as the gunman was subdued. The eruption of violence, which had lasted only minutes, had changed everything. The cafeteria, once a place of conversation and laughter, was now filled with stunned, crying, shaking students. Some screamed for help, others held friends close. Many simply sat in shock, unable to comprehend the scope of what had happened. As news of the shooting began to spread through the building, teachers moved swiftly to secure classrooms. Doors were locked. Students were instructed to remain quiet, stay low, and wait for further instructions. Hallways that had moments earlier been filled with movement fell silent. In classrooms across the school, young people clung to one another, tears streaming, fear overwhelming. They did not yet know the full extent of the tragedy, only that something terrible had happened in a place they trusted. Meanwhile, students who had managed to escape the cafeteria ran toward exits, some calling out warnings, others seeking help. Outside, the school grounds filled with terrified young people who had no idea how widespread the danger was. Some fled to neighboring houses, others waited on sidewalks, trembling, searching for friends or siblings. No one knew what would happen next. Within minutes, staff members reached the cafeteria and found that the shooter had already been restrained by students. Their first actions were not to analyze the scene, but to comfort those around them, to check on students, to call out for help, to provide whatever support they could in the face of overwhelming shock. Teachers who had spent years guiding students through academics now found themselves trying to guide them through the unthinkable. The shooting left 2 students dead and many others wounded. The loss of young lives in a place meant to nurture them would send waves of grief throughout the community. The courage displayed by students in those moments, especially those who tackled the gunman, would become one of the most talked about aspects of the tragedy, a testament to the strength that can emerge in the face of unimaginable fear. For those inside the cafeteria, time seemed to slow. The seconds after the gunman was restrained felt like hours. Sirens in the distance signaled that help was coming, but the emotional impact had already rooted. Students held each other, cried out for teachers, or sat in stunned silence. The sense of safety that had always been taken for granted had been torn away. What happened inside the cafeteria on May 21, 1998, was not just a moment of violence. It was a moment that tested the humanity, courage, and resilience of the young people who lived through it. Their actions, their fear, their bravery, all became part of the story of Thurston High, a story that would be remembered not only for its heartbreak, but for the strength that emerged in its darkest minutes.
In the moments after the shooting stopped, silence fell over the cafeteria, not the calm silence of a school morning, but the hollow, trembling quiet that follows shock. Students were crying, shaking, calling out for help. Some clung to friends, others stared straight ahead, overwhelmed and unable to speak. Teachers moved from student to student, offering whatever comfort they could while waiting for first responders. No one knew exactly what had happened in other parts of the school, and fear lingered like a shadow over every corner of the building. Outside, the first sirens pierced the stillness of Springfield's late morning. At 10 a.m., 911 dispatchers began receiving a flood of calls. Voices on the other end were frantic, students, staff, and bystanders reporting a shooting at Thurston High School. Within minutes, Springfield Police, Oregon State Police, Lane County deputies, and emergency medical teams rushed toward the campus. What they knew at that moment was limited, but they prepared for the worst. As the first patrol cars approached the school, officers saw students running from the building in tears, some screaming for help, others desperately calling out the names of friends or siblings. Many had no idea if the danger was still present. For the officers, the priority was immediate: secure the campus, stop any additional threat, and get medical assistance to those who needed it most. Police entered the school quickly and methodically. They moved through hallways, checking classrooms and guiding terrified students to safer areas. When officers reached the cafeteria, they encountered the scene that students and staff had been living through for the previous several minutes. The shooter was already restrained by the heroic actions of his classmates. Officers took him into custody and began assisting those on the floor, comforting students, identifying the injured, and directing emergency medical personnel as they arrived. Outside the school, what had begun as a normal morning transformed rapidly into a scene of overwhelming panic. Word of the shooting spread through Springfield with astonishing speed. Parents stopped work mid-shift. Some abandoned shopping carts in grocery stores. Others pulled their cars to the side of the road when they heard the news. Within minutes, families were racing toward Thurston, desperate to know if their children were safe. The roads surrounding the school became clogged with vehicles. Parents ran toward the police perimeter, many crying, others calling their children's names again and again, hoping for any sign of recognition. Officers and school staff did everything possible to keep parents informed and to direct them to designated areas, but the fear in the air was palpable. This was every parent's nightmare, a moment when time seemed to stretch endlessly as they waited for word. Emergency medical teams set up triage areas outside the school. Students with injuries were carried out by police, teachers, and paramedics, then transported to nearby hospitals. First responders acted with urgency and care, doing everything within their power to stabilize the wounded. Hospitals in the region activated emergency protocols to handle the sudden influx of patients. Nurses, surgeons, and support staff worked rapidly, knowing that every second mattered. Within the school, teachers continued to comfort students sheltered in classrooms. Many did not yet know what had happened in the cafeteria, only that something terrible had occurred. Some students whispered prayers. Others sent messages to parents if they had access to a phone. Many simply sat in silence, waiting for the moment when the doors would be opened and they would be escorted out to safety. As the hours passed, the magnitude of the situation became clearer. Authorities confirmed that 2 students had been killed and many others injured. The names of the victims had not yet been publicly released, but the loss was already deeply felt. News outlets began arriving, although police worked diligently to maintain order and protect the privacy of the students.
Community members who lived near the school opened their doors to fleeing students who'd run from campus during the initial chaos. Some provided blankets and water. Others offered their phones so students could call their parents. It was a moment of instinctive compassion. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers comforting terrified teenagers. By midday, the entire city of Springfield seemed to stand still. Businesses closed early. People gathered in churches, community centers, and living rooms, trying to understand what had happened. Rumors spread rapidly, but the truth took time to emerge as officials worked carefully to release accurate information. What remained constant was the shock, the disbelief that something so devastating had taken place in a community known for its safety and closeness. For the families of the victims, the hours following the shooting were filled with unimaginable grief. Many waited in nearby buildings or at hospitals, desperate for updates. Counselors and crisis responders arrived to support them, offering comfort even though no words could fully ease the pain of such sudden loss. Throughout the day, the bravery of the students who tackled the gunman became known to first responders. Officers, medical personnel, and school staff recognized how their quick thinking had prevented further tragedy. Their actions stood as a beacon of courage in a day filled with heartbreak. As evening approached, police completed the evacuation of the school. Classrooms were emptied, one by one, students escorted carefully through secured hallways and out to reunification areas where parents waited with open arms. The reunions were emotional, families crying, hugging, holding on to each other tightly. For many, the relief was overwhelming. For others, the grief was unthinkable. Springfield, Oregon, a town that had always believed in its safety, now faced a new reality. The shock of what had happened would ripple through the community for years to come. The panic of that morning had passed, but the pain, the questions, and the long road to healing were only beginning.
In the hours after the shooting at Thurston High School, law enforcement and investigators faced the enormous task of piecing together not only what had happened inside the cafeteria, but also what had occurred in the days and hours leading up to the tragedy. The immediate priority had been securing the school and caring for victims. Once that work was underway, the investigation began to expand in scope, reaching beyond the campus and into the home of the shooter. At the police station, officers interviewed students, teachers, cafeteria staff, and anyone who had witnessed the events. Their statements formed the earliest outline of the timeline: the moment the shooter entered the cafeteria, the first gunshots, the reactions of students and staff, and the critical actions taken by the young people who tackled and subdued the gunman. These accounts, though deeply emotional, were essential for understanding exactly how the tragedy had unfolded. Witness after witness confirmed the same sequence of events. There had been no warning, no signal indicating what was about to occur. The shooting began suddenly, and the courage of the students who intervened played a decisive role in ending the attack. Their testimonies helped investigators establish the effectiveness and timing of their actions, contributing to a clear picture of how many lives were saved through their bravery. While investigators worked to reconstruct the events inside the school, a separate team moved toward the Kinkel residence. As officers approached the home, they had no clear idea of what they might find. Their decision to enter the residence came after information surfaced during the initial questioning of the shooter, indicating that something might be wrong at the family home. Officers proceeded carefully, following established procedures for entering a potentially dangerous scene. What they discovered inside would add another devastating layer to the unfolding tragedy. The bodies of Bill and Faith Kinkel were found inside the house. Both had been killed the previous day, on May 20th. The news traveled quickly through the investigative team, adding weight to a situation already marked by profound loss. Officers secured the home, documented the scene, and began collecting evidence that would help clarify the timeline and circumstances surrounding the deaths. Inside the residence, investigators found a number of items that would later become key pieces of evidence: weapons, ammunition, and writings produced by the shooter. The journals and notes contained expressions of emotional turmoil, confusion, and personal struggle.
These materials, which had been left behind in the home, helped investigators understand the shooter's internal world in the days leading up to the tragedy. However, officials made clear that none of the writings provided a clear motive or fully explained his actions. They were pieces of a larger, complex picture, important but not definitive. Law enforcement agencies coordinated their work meticulously. The Springfield Police Department, Oregon State Police, and county investigators pooled resources, shared findings, and conducted interviews that expanded beyond the immediate witnesses. Teachers, coaches, neighbors, and peers of the shooter were questioned. Investigators sought factual clarity, not speculation, focusing on documented behavior, known actions, and verifiable details. One of the earliest points of examination was the firearm incident that had occurred at Thurston High the day before the shooting. Investigators reviewed the procedures that had taken place when the weapon was found, the steps officers had followed, and how the situation had been resolved through established protocols. The previous day's incident, though alarming, had appeared to be contained at the time. Nothing about the boy's behavior during the police interaction had indicated that further violence was imminent. As the investigation expanded, forensic teams processed the crime scene inside the cafeteria. They collected shell casings, photographed the layout, documented the positions of tables, chairs, and personal belongings left behind in the chaos. They worked with extraordinary care, knowing that every detail mattered, both for understanding the tragedy and for providing accurate information to families seeking answers. Medical staff at local hospitals collaborated with investigators by providing information about the nature and timing of the injuries treated. This helped clarify the sequence of events and supported the reconstruction of the shooting timeline. While doctors worked to stabilize the wounded and comfort grieving families, they also played a role in establishing facts crucial to the investigation. In the days that followed, the story of the shooting and the killings at the Kinkel home spread throughout the nation. Media coverage intensified, and the community found itself suddenly at the center of national attention. Investigators remained focused on their work, releasing information carefully and deliberately to ensure accuracy. They were mindful of the emotional state of the community and took care not to release details that would further traumatize families and students. Despite the pressure, officials handled the case with professionalism and sensitivity. Their updates emphasized verified facts: the number of victims, the timeline of the shootings, the actions of students who subdued the gunman, and the discovery of the parents in the home. They avoided speculation about motive and instead focused on the concrete evidence collected from the school, the residents, and personal writings. As the investigation continued, many in the community began searching for answers that could explain the unexplainable. Counselors, faith leaders, and educators stepped forward to support grieving families and struggling students. While investigators worked to understand the events from a factual standpoint, the community wrestled with the emotional and spiritual weight of what had happened. In time, a full investigative report was assembled. It documented the sequence of events, beginning with the firearm incident on May 20th, the tragic killings at the Kinkel home, the morning of May 21st, and the shooting at Thurston High School. It detailed the response of law enforcement, the bravery of students and teachers, and the tragedies suffered by the victims and their families. It became the official record of one of the most devastating events in Oregon's history, a record grounded in evidence, clarity, and respect for the lives affected. The investigation provided answers, but it could not provide healing. That task would fall to the people of Springfield, who would soon begin the long, painful process of mourning, rebuilding, and finding a way to move forward.
In the days following the tragedy, the city of Springfield entered a period of profound grief. Families mourned, students struggled to understand the enormity of what they had lived through, and the community sought ways to support the wounded and comfort the bereaved. Amid this emotional landscape, the legal process began. It moved slowly and deliberately, mindful of the pain the tragedy had already inflicted. The shooter, Kip Kinkel, was taken into custody at the scene and transported to the police station immediately after the attack. His arrest ended the physical danger he posed, but it also marked the beginning of a long legal journey. Officials handled the case with care, recognizing the complexities involved and the deep trauma experienced by the people of Springfield. Within days, prosecutors filed multiple charges. These included murder charges for the killings of his parents, Bill and Faith Kinkel, as well as 2 counts of aggravated murder for the deaths of Thurston High students Ben Walker and Michael Nicolau. Additional charges were filed for attempted murder, relating to the many students injured in the cafeteria. The list of charges reflected both the scope of the tragedy and the seriousness with which the state intended to pursue justice. From the beginning, the defense did not contest that Kinkel had carried out the shootings. The focus of the legal proceedings centered instead on how the case would be resolved, what sentence would be appropriate, and how the court could acknowledge the profound harm done to so many families. The prosecution worked closely with investigators to present an accurate, factual account of the events. The defense, meanwhile, gathered records, interviews, and expert analyses to support their arguments in court. Both sides understood the weight of the case. During pretrial hearings, the courtroom often filled with victims' families, community members, and survivors seeking clarity. Their presence was a reminder of the human impact behind every document and legal argument. They listened as prosecutors outlined the timeline of the tragedy, drawing from months of investigative work. They heard testimony from officers, medical responders, and forensic experts. Each detail reinforced the scale of the loss experienced by the community. In September 1999, rather than taking the case to trial, the defense entered guilty pleas on Kinkel's behalf for 4 counts of murder and 26 counts of attempted murder. This decision avoided the need for a full trial, sparing survivors and families from reliving the events through lengthy testimony. Still, even without a trial, the sentencing phase carried immense emotional weight. During sentencing hearings, the court heard powerful statements from the families of the victims. These were moments of raw honesty, expressions of grief, of love for the children and parents lost, and of the deep wounds carried by those who survived. Some spoke of futures stolen, of milestones their children would never reach. Others expressed hope for healing, even amidst unimaginable pain. Their voices became part of the public record, ensuring that the lives of their loved ones were honored and remembered with dignity. Prosecutors asked the court for a sentence that reflected the severity of the crimes. They emphasized the deliberate nature of the shootings and the lasting harm done to dozens of families. They cited the bravery of the students who intervened, the terror experienced by those in the cafeteria, and the lifelong effects of the injuries suffered by survivors. The defense, while acknowledging the tragedy, presented arguments for leniency grounded in the defendant's age and mental health. They described the internal struggles documented in his writings and raised concerns about imposing a sentence that would last for the entirety of his life. Their position, however, stood in sharp contrast to the enormity of the harm inflicted. In November 1999, Judge Jack Billings delivered his decision. He sentenced Kinkel to 111 years and 8 months in prison without the possibility of parole. It was one of the longest sentences ever imposed on a juvenile in the state of Oregon. The judge stated that the sentence reflected not only the gravity of the crimes, but also the need to protect the community and honor the lives that had been lost. The courtroom reaction was a mixture of quiet relief and solemn reflection. For many families, the sentence brought a measure of closure, a recognition by the justice system of the devastation they had endured. For others, no legal outcome could erase the pain or restore what had been taken. The sentence, however, marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of a long process of healing for the entire community. In the years that followed, the case continued to receive legal attention. Kinkel sought to appeal his sentence, citing evolving standards regarding juvenile sentencing. These petitions sparked legal discussions across Oregon and the United States, reflecting broader debates about how the justice system should treat juveniles who commit serious crimes. Despite these efforts,
courts repeatedly upheld the original sentence, concluding that it was appropriate given the severity of the tragedy. Through all these proceedings, public officials remained united in their message. The priority was honoring the victims, supporting the survivors, and ensuring that the events of May 21, 1998 were neither forgotten nor repeated. Their statements emphasized community resilience, the need for ongoing support for those affected, and the importance of preserving the memories of the young lives lost. The legal process, though essential, could never fully heal the wounds left by the tragedy. It could assign responsibility, it could deliver a measure of justice, but it could not restore the lives that had been taken or erase the fear, grief, and trauma carried by the survivors. Those tasks, the healing, the remembering, the rebuilding, would become the work of families, students, teachers, and the city of Springfield itself.
The sentence closed the judicial chapter of the tragedy, but its emotional chapter continued. And as Springfield looked toward the future, the community would carry forward the responsibility of honoring the victims, supporting one another, and keeping their memories alive. Every tragedy is measured not in headlines, not in statistics, but in lives. The lives lost, the lives forever changed, and the futures that never had the chance to unfold. At Thurston High School, 2 young men were killed on May 21, 1998. Their names, their stories, and their memories remain at the center of this tragedy. They were not numbers. They were sons, friends, brothers, students, young people whose presence shaped the world around them. Ben Walker, 16 years old. Ben was known for his kindness, his bright spirit, and the way he treated people with genuine warmth. Friends described him as someone who listened deeply, who laughed easily, and who made others feel valued. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind of character that made people trust him instantly. Ben loved spending time outdoors, especially in the forests and fields that surrounded Springfield. He was thoughtful, responsible, and full of potential. In the classroom, he worked hard and encouraged others without hesitation. At home, he was deeply loved, a son whose future was unfolding with promise. His life, cut tragically short, left a space in the world that can never be filled. Michael Nicolau, 17 years old. Michael had an energy that could light up a room. He was known for his friendly nature, his enthusiasm, and his ability to make people smile. Friends remember him as someone who lifted others up, who brought joy into everyday moments. Michael was a talented athlete, dedicated to his passions both on and off the field. He had goals, dreams, and a determination that inspired those around him. His teachers spoke of his curiosity, his drive, and his ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Michael's family cherished him deeply, celebrating his accomplishments and supporting his ambitions. His passing left a profound void for everyone who knew him. These 2 young men were the heart of the tragedy's greatest loss. Their families, parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, were thrust into a grief that no family should ever endure. They faced a future forever marked by absence, by birthdays that would never be celebrated, by milestones that would never arrive. Yet through unimaginable pain, they found ways to honor their sons' memories, through scholarships, community involvement, and acts of kindness that reflected the spirit of who Ben and Michael were. Beyond the 2 lives lost, the tragedy left dozens of students with physical injuries and emotional wounds that would take years to understand, let alone heal. Many of the young people in the cafeteria that day left with scars, some visible, others held deep within. They were teenagers facing a trauma most adults could not comprehend. Their lives changed in seconds, and the path to recovery was neither quick nor simple. Some survivors spoke openly about their experiences, sharing stories of fear, resilience, and healing. Others chose silence, carrying their memories quietly. But every survivor, whether they spoke publicly or not, carried the weight of that day. They carried the memory of friends injured, friends lost. They carried the sound, the shock, the confusion, and they carried the strength it took to walk back into a school building, to sit in classrooms again, and try to rebuild a sense of normalcy that had been shattered. Teachers and staff were also deeply affected. These were adults who had dedicated their lives to guiding and protecting young people, suddenly faced with a tragedy they could not have anticipated. Some had pulled students to safety. Some had run toward danger. All were left to reconcile what they had seen and the burden of supporting students through the aftermath. Their courage during the shooting became one of the most honored aspects of the tragedy, but the emotional cost they carried was immense. Parents throughout Springfield felt a shift that day too. Even those whose children were uninjured experienced fear unlike anything they had known. The belief that school was a safe haven, a sacred assumption that families across America rely on, had been shaken. For many, that fear lingered long after the news cameras left and the country's attention shifted elsewhere. The tragedy also rippled outward into the Springfield community. Neighbors supported one another. Churches opened their doors. Counselors, volunteers, and local leaders stepped forward to help families navigate grief and trauma. Candlelight vigils drew thousands, each person gathering to honor the victims, to embrace survivors, and to remind the community that they were not alone. Ben and Michael's classmates would grow older, graduate, begin careers, start families, all while carrying the memory of the friends they lost. Their absence was felt at graduations, at reunions, in the quiet moments when former classmates looked back and remembered the young men who should have been there. Their names, Ben Walker and Michael Nicolau, remain a central part of Thurston High's legacy. They are spoken with respect, with love, and with a determination to ensure they are never forgotten. Their stories continue through the people who knew them, the families who loved them, and the community that carries their memory forward. The tragedy at Thurston High changed lives, but the lives of the young men lost were not defined by the violence that took them. They were defined by their character, their dreams, their kindness, and the future they represented. The story of Thurston High is above all else a story about them, about the survivors who endured the unimaginable, and about a community bound together by grief and healing.
In the days following the tragedy at Thurston High School, Springfield entered a period of reflection unlike anything it had ever known. The city, once defined by its quiet neighborhoods and strong community bonds, now carried a collective grief that touched every family, every street, and every classroom. The tragedy had left deep wounds, yet even in the earliest hours of sorrow, something powerful began to emerge: the resilience of a community determined to heal together. Schools across the district opened their doors to students, teachers, and families seeking comfort. Counselors arrived from across Oregon, offering support to anyone in need. Churches and community centers became gathering places where people could sit quietly, talk openly, or simply be surrounded by others who understood the weight of the moment. Springfield united in a spirit of compassion, refusing to let anyone face grief alone. As the days turned into weeks, the people of Thurston High began the slow and difficult journey toward recovery. Returning to the campus was emotional for many. The hallways felt familiar, yet changed. Every step carried memories of what had transpired, but also a determination to reclaim the school as a place of learning and safety. Teachers, students, and staff moved forward with courage, creating spaces where healing could begin. One conversation, one gesture of kindness, one day at a time. Memorials appeared across the community. Flowers, handwritten notes, banners, and candles lined the sidewalks near the school. People came at all hours to leave messages of love and remembrance for the victims.
Many of these memorials became gathering points where students cried together, shared memories, and honored the lives of Ben Walker and Michael Nicolau. Their names, written in careful script across posters and cards, stood as reminders that they would always be part of Thurston High's story. In time, more permanent memorials were created. A plaque bearing the names of the victims was installed on campus. Scholarship funds were established in memory of Ben and Michael, supporting students whose futures reflected the hopes the two young men had carried. These tributes served as lasting symbols of love, ensuring that their legacies would continue through opportunities extended to future generations. Teachers, too, played a vital role in the healing process. Many attended grief trainings, prepared new resources, and adapted their classrooms to support students emotionally as well as academically. Their presence, steady, compassionate, unwavering, provided a lifeline for young people struggling to understand their feelings. In a tragedy that shook their own hearts, educators became anchors for the students who looked to them for reassurance. Families of survivors faced unique challenges. Some children battled fear when returning to school. Others struggled with nightmares or unexpected triggers. Parents walked a delicate path, offering comfort while navigating their own grief and uncertainty. Community organizations provided resources, counseling, and long-term support systems to help families carry the emotional burden. Springfield, in its unity, focused on building the networks needed to help everyone impacted by the tragedy move forward. As the months passed, the story of Thurston High became a national reference point in conversations about school safety, youth support, and community preparedness. Leaders across the country studied how Springfield responded: the rapid coordination of law enforcement, the strong presence of mental health resources, and the deep involvement of families and community members in healing. Though the tragedy itself was heartbreaking, the response demonstrated the power of unity in moments of profound crisis. The healing journey, however, was not linear. Anniversaries of the shooting brought waves of emotion. Graduations carried a quiet ache for the classmates who should have been there. Some students and families found comfort in sharing memories publicly. Others chose quiet reflection. Everyone healed in their own way and their own time. What remained constant was the community's determination to never forget the lives lost and the courage shown. Each year, students and staff at Thurston High paused to honor Ben and Michael, remembering their personalities, their dreams, and the futures they deserved. Survivors continued to support each other, forming bonds that would last a lifetime. Bonds forged in hardship, strengthened in healing, and sustained by love. As new generations of students walked the halls of Thurston High, the story of May 21, 1998, became part of the school's history. Not to instill fear, but to honor resilience. Teachers shared lessons in compassion. Administrators strengthened safety procedures. Students showed remarkable empathy, understanding that their school had endured something significant long before they arrived. The legacy of Thurston High became one of remembrance and unity, not darkness. Springfield as a whole grew stronger in the years after the tragedy. Community programs expanded. Mental health support became a priority. Families, once shaken by fear, rebuilt their sense of security. And through it all, the memory of the victims remained central, a reminder of why healing mattered, why community mattered, and why remembering mattered. The tragedy of Thurston High will always be one of the most painful chapters in Oregon's history, but woven through that pain is also the story of bravery, compassion, and unwavering resilience. It is the story of a community that refused to be defined by violence, choosing instead to define itself by the love shared in the aftermath, by the lives honored, and by the healing pursued together. Today, the legacy of May 21, 1998,
lives on not only in memorials or ceremonies, but in the strength of the people who continue to carry the memories of Ben Walker and Michael Nicolau in their hearts. Their lives changed Springfield. Their absence is felt, but their names endure. And as the years pass, the community remains committed to remembering, not because the tragedy defines them, but because the people lost deserve to be remembered with dignity and love. Share this story. Remember the lives impacted, because healing begins when we refuse to forget.